a woman's perspective, Artemisia Gentileschi. One of the most common scenes that Artemisia Gentileschi painted was Judith and Holofernes. This is a biblical story from the Book of Judith, where a pious Jewish woman, Judith, she goes to stop the head of the Assyrian army, Holofernes, who was coming to destroy her town. She gets herself all dressed up one night, and she goes and she gets him very drunk after she seduces him, and she cuts his head off. Now, we can see between these two versions, Caravaggio's on the left and Artemisia Gentileschi's on the right, that they are both so clearly Baroque pieces. It is so clear that both pieces are Baroque because we can see in the dark background in both of them that pushes that composition to the front. We feel the emotion, the tension, the fear, the pain. We can feel everything. There's this real sense of this moment that has been captured in time that we can see in both these works. As we can see in Caravaggio's version on the left, Judith looks terrified. She is holding the sword very daintily in her hand, and she looks very perfect still. Her hair is still perfect, her dress is still perfect, everything is perfect, and she is very tentatively holding on to Holofernes' head and very tentatively holding on to the sword. She doesn't seem to have a good grip on it. She looks terrified and doesn't sort of display this narrative of Judith taking her fate into her own hands. And we can also see the maidservant next to her looks like an old crone, basically. She looks like a Disney villain that lives in the woods, so not very representative of this narrative of a woman taking her fate into her own hands. But now we switch over to Artemisia's version and we really get that sense. Both of these women have their sleeves pushed up, there is blood everywhere, and neither of them looks scared of what's happening. Neither of them looks terrified of the blood, although they should be, because objectively blood is terrifying. But both these women have such a strong look of determination on their faces, and their sleeves are rolled up. They are really using their entire bodies to just hold this man down because they have no other choice. They have to do this because this is the only way to save their town. And Judith is really taking her fate into her own hands, and we really get that sense here through the way that Judith is depicted and the way that we see these two women who are very small in comparison to Holofernes overpowering him and cutting his head off because this is the only way that Judith can protect her hometown and her people. So, on to a little bit of a brief history on Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia Gentileschi was born in 1593, and she began painting in 1610. As we can see in the top right, the first work that she created was Susanna and the Elders. She died in about 1654, though the exact date is not entirely known. So she started painting in 1610, and in 1611, Orazio Gentileschi, her father, hired a man named Agostino Tassi to teach her. And then in the year 1616, she was admitted to a very prestigious academy that had never before admitted female painters, and she was the first, so created a record there. And so we see Susanna and the Elders on the top right, 1610, and then on the bottom right, we have Danae, 1612. So both of these are early works of Gentileschi's, a little bit of a background on where we're heading with the rest of her works. Now moving on to Susanna and the Elders. This painting was created in 1610, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this is another story that has been depicted a few times throughout history, but Artemisia Gentileschi changed the way that she depicted this scene. Now, the original story is Susanna, the woman in this painting. She is bathing herself in a lake and in a secluded area, and she, of course, is naked, and she's all by herself. She thinks she's alone, and these two men are watching her creepily from the side, and they come over and they start badgering her, accosting her, and they basically give her an ultimatum. Either we take advantage of you and we rape you, or option number 2 is we tell everybody a rumor that you are out here with a lover. And option number 2 was worse for Susanna's reputation, so she was sort of forced to take option number 1, and which wasn't really quite an option for her at the time, but that's another story for later. So Susanna was taken advantage of by these two men. Now, in most works that we see of Susanna and the Elders, Susanna herself is sort of standing with her arms wide open, no clothes on, everything out in the open, basically saying, take advantage of me, I'm here for you and for you only. Now, this version is really different. This is one of the first times that we see a scene of sexual predation from the perspective of the ones being preyed upon, not the predators. We see that Susanna herself in this is terrified. There's a strong look of disgust on her face. She has one hand attempting to sort of either cover her face or protect herself, and another hand that's sort of pushed out. And although these efforts are a bit trivial because these men are obvious, there's two of them and they're going to be much stronger than her, there is still this clear sense of her trying to protect herself and her trying to not let these men take over her. And so this work also, there's a little bit of a nod to this power of Susanna in the way that Gentileschi has chosen to depict Susanna herself. Not only in the way that her face is disgusted and her hands are sort of pushed out to stop the men from coming at her, but the fact that we don't see all of her body. Really, only one of her breasts are exposed. The rest of her body is pretty much covered. And so the amazing thing about this is it's sort of another nod to the idea that Susanna is just bathing herself. She's not there for our pleasure and for us to just gawk at. She's there doing her own thing. And I love this sort of nod to the original story. So as I mentioned before, in 1611, Orazio hired a man, Agostino Tassi, to become Artemisia's teacher. Now, a few years after after Tassi was hired, he took advantage of Artemisia and he raped her. And she told her father fired him, there was a huge trial, Artemisia was tortured to make sure that she was telling the truth, and Tassi was sentenced to a few years of exile, but he did not oblige by his punishment, and no one decided to enforce it, so he didn't really face any punishment for his crimes. However, the fact that this case even went to trial is a magnificent achievement for the 17th century, but I digress. So there is a theory that the head of Holofernes in this specific work is actually the face of Tassi, and it was sort of Artemisia's way of getting back at this man who took a piece of her and took advantage of her at this horrible time in her life. Now, a lot of people tend to look at Artemisia Gentileschi's work through the eye of she was raped when she was younger. That's the primary motivation for a lot of her works, and it's sad because a lot of her great works are overshadowed by this horrible thing that happened to her, and it's not fair to her legacy that this happened. And she was such an amazing woman, and she created such an amazing reputation for herself that this should not be the primary reason of why she's remembered. Artemisia Gentileschi was an amazing woman who subverted the narrative and gave women a more realistic shot in artwork and in society. And so from a woman's perspective, Artemisia Gentileschi, thank you for listening.